Welcome, thrill seekers and true crime aficionados. Before we delve into a chilling tale that will keep you on the edge of your seats, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future deep dives into the dark corners of the human psyche. Tonight, we unravel the terrifying saga of the Centenarian killer, when a man over 50 years old unleashes terror. Prepare yourselves, for the story you are about to read proves that evil knows no age, and some shadows lengthen with time, growing only more menacing. The year was 2015. In the quaint, often overlooked town of Oakhaven, nestled amidst rolling hills and whispered legends of forgotten times, lived Arthur Penhaligon. At 63, Arthur was, to all outward appearances, the epitome of a harmless, if somewhat eccentric, elder statesman. His silver hair, meticulously combed, framed a face etched with the benevolent wrinkles of a life seemingly well-lived. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, often twinkled behind spectacles perched precariously on his aquiline nose. He wore tweed jackets, even in unsuitably warm weather, and carried a worn leather satchel wherever he went, giving him the air of a retired academic or a particularly studious birdwatcher. Oakhaven was a town where gossip was the primary currency, and secrets were as rare as a quiet Sunday. Yet Arthur Penhaligon remained an enigma. He had moved to Oakhaven 15 years prior, a widower from an unspecified northern city, seeking, as he put it, a more contemplative existence. He bought a small Victorian-era house on the outskirts of town, its once grand facade now softened by overgrown ivy and a perpetually slightly too long lawn. He kept to himself, tending his rose garden with a fastidious devotion, occasionally exchanging polite, almost formal greetings with his neighbors, the elderly Mrs. Gable and the perpetually anxious Mr. Henderson. His routine was clockwork. Mornings began with the delivery of the daily newspaper, which he would read on his porch swing, a cup of Earl Grey steaming beside him. Afternoons were for gardening or, on inclement days, for retreating to his study, a room rarely seen by outsiders, filled with towering bookshelves and the faint scent of old paper and pipe tobacco, though no one had ever seen Arthur smoke. Evenings concluded with a solitary supper and the soft glow of a reading lamp visible through his parlor window until precisely 10 o'clock. No one in Oakhaven truly knew Arthur. They knew of him. They knew he paid his taxes on time, never caused a disturbance, and contributed a modest sum to the annual Oakhaven Historical Society fundraiser. He was simply Arthur, part of the town's quiet backdrop, and that he preferred. For beneath the placid surface of Arthur Penhaligon, beneath the tweed and the spectacles and the meticulously tended roses, lay a mind as complex and twisted as a forgotten root system, slowly, patiently preparing to surface. Arthur's past was a carefully constructed void. He claimed, worked as a librarian, then a freelance editor. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away peacefully in her sleep, a victim of a weak heart. He spoke of her with a gentle sadness, a mournful sigh that seemed to validate his quiet solitude. No family ever visited, no old friends called. When questioned, he would simply offer a vague smile and say, "My roots are thin, I'm afraid. My generation, you see, a bit scattered." But Arthur's roots were not thin. They were deeply buried, intertwined with secrets so dark they threatened to choke the very light from Oakhaven. His contemplative existence was not born of a desire for peace, but a meticulously planned retreat, a strategic withdrawal. For Arthur Penhaligon was not simply a widower. He was a meticulous observer, a patient predator, and his move to Oakhaven was not to escape the world, but to find a new hunting ground, unmarred by the ghosts of his past. His true story began not in a library, but in the cold, sterile confines of a state institution decades earlier. Born Arthur Finch, he had spent his formative years navigating a fractured home, punctuated by an abusive father and a meek, despairing mother. The details were murky, even to Arthur now, fragmented memories of fear and a simmering rage. What was clear was the incident that had changed everything. A fire, a house fire, when Arthur was 16. His parents trapped. Arthur, miraculously, escaping without a scratch. The official report, faulty wiring. Arthur knew better. He knew the spark, the flicker, the rapid spread of the flames. He knew the quiet satisfaction that had bloomed in his chest as the sirens wailed. After the fire, he was shuffled between distant relatives, none of whom truly wanted him. He learned to adapt, to observe, to blend. He discovered the subtle art of camouflage, of becoming invisible in plain sight. He excelled in school, a quiet, brilliant student, a master of dissimulation. He learned to mimic emotions, to project an image of normalcy that was utterly foreign to his internal landscape. His early adulthood was marked by a series of geographic shifts and occupational changes, always leaving before anyone could look too closely. He worked as an archivist, a night watchman, even a mortician's assistant for a brief, morbidly fascinating period. Each role offered him unique insights into human vulnerability, into the mechanics of disappearance, into the fleeting nature of life itself. He studied human behavior with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining specimens under a microscope. He learned their habits, their fears, their predictable patterns. Eleanor, his wife, had been his most elaborate deception. She was a gentle, unassuming woman, drawn to Arthur's quiet intelligence and what she perceived as a profound sensitivity. He had courted her with an almost theatrical charm, a carefully constructed persona of a shy, intellectual man yearning for companionship. Their marriage was a charade, a means to an end. Eleanor provided a veneer of respectability, a shield against probing questions. Her eventual death, deemed natural, was meticulously orchestrated, a testament to Arthur's chilling precision. A subtle adjustment to her medication, a gradual weakening, a quiet decline. No one suspected, no one ever did. With Eleanor gone, Arthur was free, free to pursue his true calling. He saw himself not as a killer, but as an architect of absence. He didn't crave the thrill of the chase, the visceral act of violence. No, Arthur's methods were far more sophisticated, far more insidious. He savored the unraveling, the slow, agonizing realization that something precious had simply vanished. And in Oakhaven, a town built on routine and predictability, he saw a fertile ground for his particular brand of terror. His target selection was as meticulous as his rose pruning. Not the young, the vibrant, the ones with loud voices and bustling families who would stir up a storm. No, Arthur preferred the quiet, the elderly, the forgotten. Those whose disappearance would be attributed to wandering minds, natural causes, or simply the slow fade into obscurity. He sought out those whose lives had already begun to diminish, those whose absence would ripple outwards like a stone in a pond, but never quite crash against the shore. His initial forays into Oakhaven's social fabric were tentative, observational. He joined the local bridge club not to play, but to listen. He attended town hall meetings, a silent presence in the back row, absorbing the rhythms of the community. He learned who lived alone, who had few visitors, who held on to routines with the stubborn grip of old age. He mentally cataloged their vulnerabilities, their habits, their comings and goings. His first target in Oakhaven was Agnes Periwinkle. Agnes, 78, lived 3 streets over, a widow notorious for her collection of porcelain dolls and her fiercely independent spirit. She had outlived all her siblings, and her only child had moved to Australia decades ago, rarely calling. Agnes's most significant social interaction was her weekly bridge game at the community center and her daily walk to the corner shop for her favorite brand of digestive biscuits. Arthur observed Agnes for weeks. He noted her precise walking route, the exact time she left, the brief, predictable conversations she had with the shopkeeper, Mr. Petrov. He knew her routine intimately, knew the precise moment her house would be empty, knew the faint creak of her front gate. He didn't seek to harm her in her home. That was too messy, too direct. Arthur preferred the ethereal, the almost magical disappearance. One crisp autumn morning, as Agnes embarked on her usual walk, Arthur was waiting. Not in a dark alley, not with a weapon. He was simply there, a silver-haired gentleman walking in the opposite direction, holding a bouquet of freshly cut roses from his garden. As they neared each other, He stumbled slightly, letting a single perfect red rose fall from his bouquet, landing directly in Agnes's path. "Oh, dear me," Arthur exclaimed, his voice a practiced blend of mild embarrassment and gentle concern. "So clumsy of me. My apologies, madam." Agnes, a woman who rarely spoke to strangers beyond a curt nod, found herself disarmed by his earnest apology and the undeniable beauty of the fallen rose. "No harm done," she mumbled, bending slowly to pick it up. As she straightened, Arthur met her gaze, his watery blue eyes holding a warmth she hadn't encountered in years. "A small token for your trouble, then," he said, offering her another rose from his bouquet. "They're from my own garden. Crimson glory. Eleanor, my late wife, always adored them." Agnes, flustered, accepted the rose. "They're beautiful," she said, a faint blush creeping up her wrinkled cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Penhaligon," Arthur supplied with a polite bow. "Arthur Penhaligon. And you must be the delightful Agnes, if my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, is to be believed." He offered a charming, almost shy smile. This seemingly innocuous encounter was the first thread in Arthur's intricate web. He engaged Agnes in polite conversation, discussing the weather, the local rose show, the changing colors of the autumn leaves. He walked with her for a few blocks, maintaining a respectful distance, never pressing, always listening. He discovered her fondness for classical music, her lament about the lack of good company for a game of Scrabble. He left her at the corner shop, a promise of another conversation, another rose, hanging unspoken in the air. Over the next few weeks, these chance encounters became more frequent, more intentional. Arthur would happen to be pruning his roses when Agnes walked by, or just returning from an errand when she was on her way to the community center. He became her confidant, her gentle companion. He listened to her stories of bygone Oakhaven, her quiet loneliness, her regrets. He built a bridge of trust, brick by agonizing brick, until Agnes, a woman who had lived a life fiercely independent, began to look forward to his presence, to his quiet attentiveness. Then, one brisk Tuesday, Arthur invited Agnes for tea at his home. "My house can get rather lonely," he confessed, his voice tinged with a carefully crafted vulnerability. "And I find I miss the gentle art of conversation. Perhaps, if you're not too busy, you might grace my humble abode." Agnes, flattered and genuinely touched, accepted. She dressed in her best woolen dress, dabbed on a hint of lavender perfume, and walked the familiar route to Arthur's house, a sense of hopeful anticipation bubbling within her. She was a woman who had spent years in quiet solitude, and the thought of an afternoon spent with a kind, intelligent man, discussing roses and local history, was a rare and welcome treat. Arthur greeted her at the door with a warm smile, ushering her into his meticulously neat, if somewhat formal, parlor. The scent of fresh tea and something sweet, perhaps homemade scones, hung in the air. Classical music, a gentle piano sonata, played softly in the background. It was, Agnes thought, utterly charming. The conversation flowed easily. Arthur was a masterful conversationalist, effortlessly steering the discussion, asking insightful questions, making her feel heard, valued. He spoke of his late wife, Eleanor, with a melancholic affection, drawing parallels between Eleanor's love for gardening and Agnes's own quiet passions. He poured her tea, served her a scone with homemade jam, and watched her with those pale blue eyes that seemed to hold a profound understanding. Agnes felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She confided in him about her anxieties, her fear of falling, her frustration with the changing world. Arthur listened, nodded, offered comforting words. He was, she thought, a true gentleman. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the parlor, Arthur offered Agnes a final cup of tea. "A special blend," he said, pouring from a delicate, porcelain teapot. "Eleanor's favorite. A soothing chamomile, perfect for the evening." Agnes, feeling utterly relaxed and content, took the cup. The tea was fragrant, warming. She sipped it slowly, enjoying the lingering warmth. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of finally being truly seen. She smiled at Arthur, a genuine, unburdened smile. "You're a truly kind man, Arthur," she said, her voice soft with contentment. Arthur returned her smile, a slow, almost imperceptible widening of his lips. "And you, dear Agnes," he replied, his voice a low, even murmur, "are a truly beautiful soul." Agnes felt a sudden, unexpected wave of drowsiness wash over her. Her eyelids grew heavy. The music seemed to recede, replaced by a gentle buzzing in her ears. She tried to speak, to thank him again, but her tongue felt thick, her thoughts muddled. The cup slipped from her fingers, clattering softly onto the Persian rug. Arthur watched, unmoving, as Agnes's head lolled to one side, her breathing growing shallow. He waited patiently for a full 5 minutes. Then, with a sigh that seemed more of meticulous satisfaction than regret, he rose. There was no struggle, no violence, just a quiet, almost imperceptible slipping away. Agnes Periwinkle had vanished. The next morning, Mrs. Gable noticed Agnes's curtains were still drawn at an unusually late hour. Mr. Henderson saw that the daily newspaper remained on her porch. Calls went unanswered. The police were eventually notified. A search began. Neighbors canvassed the area. Posters went up with Agnes's smiling, if slightly faded, photograph. But there was no trace, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, just an empty house, a lingering scent of lavender, and a porcelain doll still seated primly on a velvet cushion. The police, after a thorough but fruitless investigation, eventually concluded that Agnes, in her advanced age, had likely wandered off, perhaps succumbed to the elements, her body lost to the vast, untamed countryside surrounding Oakhaven. It was a sad, but not entirely uncommon, occurrence in a town with a growing elderly population. Arthur Penhaligon, of course, offered his condolences to the neighbors, his face a picture of somber concern. He even joined the search party for a few hours, his tweed jacket and spectacles a familiar, comforting sight amidst the worried faces. He spoke of Agnes with a gentle fondness, lamenting the loss of such a sweet, spirited woman. He offered Mrs. Gable a small bouquet of white roses, a gesture of sympathy that cemented his image as a caring, upstanding member of the community. The disappearance of Agnes Periwinkle settled over Oakhaven like a persistent, chilly fog. It was a tragedy, a mystery, but one that gradually faded into the background, becoming another whispered story in the town's quiet history. Life, as it always does, went on. But in the quiet solitude of his study, Arthur Penhaligon felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The first thread had been pulled. The first disappearance had been orchestrated. He had tested his methods, refined his timing, perfected his persona. He had proven, once again, that the most terrifying monsters are not those that roar, but those that whisper, those that blend, those that are utterly, tragically unremarkable. And as the weeks turned into months, Arthur began to observe again, his pale blue eyes scanning the quiet streets of Oakhaven, seeking out his next target, his next masterpiece of absence. The Centenarian killer had just begun his reign. Hidden in plain sight, a wolf in tweed, patiently waiting for the quiet dusk to truly descend. The stage was set, and Oakhaven, oblivious and serene, was his unsuspecting theater. The initial shock of Agnes Periwinkle's disappearance eventually receded, morphing into a lingering sadness that occasionally surfaced during bridge games or at the local grocery store. Oakhaven, a town accustomed to the gentle rhythm of life and death, simply added Agnes to its list of unanswered questions. No one, not even the most seasoned detective, would have connected her vanishing to the kindly, unassuming Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur, meanwhile, continued his meticulously crafted existence. His rose garden flourished, his tweed jackets remained impeccably pressed, and his interactions with neighbors were precisely calibrated. Polite, brief, and always just friendly enough to deflect suspicion. He attended Agnes's memorial service, offering a touching, albeit short, eulogy that spoke of her quiet grace and independent spirit. His performance was flawless, earning him nods of approval and whispered condolences. But beneath the surface, a subtle shift was occurring within Arthur. The success with Agnes had not sated him. It had sharpened his appetite. He felt a thrill, a deep, unsettling satisfaction, at the seamlessness of her disappearance. It was a testament to his intellect, his planning, his almost artistic execution. He wasn't simply removing people. He was erasing them, leaving no trace, no struggle, just a void where a life once was. This wasn't violence. It was an act of profound, chilling control. His next target was Mr. Edgar Finch, a man in his early 80s who lived in a sprawling, dilapidated farmhouse on the very edge of Oakhaven. Edgar was a recluse, known for his eccentricities and his fierce distrust of outsiders. He rarely left his property, preferring the company of his dogs and his vast, disorganized collection of antique books. His only contact with the outside world was a weekly delivery of groceries by a taciturn teenager from the general store. Edgar had no known living relatives, and his nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away. He was, in Arthur's estimation, an ideal candidate. Arthur began his observation of Edgar with even greater precision than he had applied to Agnes. He drove past the farmhouse at various times of the day, noting the patterns of the dogs, the infrequent movements within the house, the exact timing of the grocery delivery. He learned that Edgar had a deep-seated suspicion of banks and kept large sums of cash hidden around his property, a detail he gleaned from a casual conversation overheard at the local hardware store, a small tidbit dismissed as local gossip, but to Arthur, a crucial piece of the puzzle. Unlike Agnes, Edgar could not be charmed. He was too wary, too isolated. A direct approach was out of the question. Arthur needed a different strategy, one that capitalized on Edgar's paranoia and reclusiveness. He needed to make Edgar disappear from within, to make it seem as though he had simply retreated further into his own self-imposed exile, eventually succumbing to the natural elements or his own failing health. The first step involved establishing a subtle, almost subliminal presence. Arthur began leaving small, seemingly random items near Edgar's property line. A single brightly colored feather, a strangely shaped stone, a small, intricate carving of a bird's nest. These were placed just within Edgar's line of sight, enough to be noticed, but not so overtly as to seem like trespassing. He wanted to cultivate a sense of unease, a feeling of being watched, without any visible watcher. Edgar, true to form, noticed. He would find the objects, his brow furrowed in suspicion, his dogs growling softly. He'd inspect them, turn them over, then discard them with a grunt. But they left a seed of doubt, a subtle ripple in the otherwise placid pool of his solitude. Who was leaving these? Why? Was someone trying to get his attention? Was it a warning? Next, Arthur began making very subtle alterations to Edgar's property. A gate, usually slightly ajar, would be carefully closed. A loose shingle on the shed roof would be quietly replaced. A fallen branch, usually left to rot, would be neatly piled. These were not acts of vandalism, but rather acts of subtle interference, acts that suggested a presence, a knowing hand, but one that was not overtly hostile. Edgar would notice these changes, his paranoia steadily increasing. He would check his locks repeatedly, scrutinize the treeline, his sleep becoming restless. He began to see shadows where there were none, to hear whispers on the wind. Arthur knew that an isolated mind, already prone to suspicion, could be easily manipulated. He wanted Edgar to believe his property was being subtly invaded, not by a person, but by something more insidious, something unseen, something supernatural even. He wanted Edgar to feel truly alone, truly vulnerable, with no one to believe his increasingly wild claims. The final phase of Arthur's plan involved a quiet night, a moonless sky, and a carefully chosen set of tools. He approached the farmhouse under the cover of darkness, moving with the practiced stealth of a shadow. He disabled the outdoor lights, expertly bypassing the rudimentary security system Edgar had installed. The dogs, strangely, were silent. Arthur had, over the preceding weeks, left them treats laced with a mild sedative, gradually conditioning them to accept his presence, to view him not as a threat, but as a source of unexpected kindness. He entered the house through a rarely used back door, which he had subtly tampered with during his earlier acts of kindness, loosening the latch just enough to allow for a silent entry. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of books and dusty furniture, dimly lit by the faint glow of a gas lamp in Edgar's study. Arthur moved through the house with a preternatural quietness, his footsteps unheard over the creaking of the old floorboards. He found Edgar asleep in his armchair, a half-finished book resting on his chest, a loyal dog curled at his feet. The room smelled of old paper and wood smoke. Arthur approached the sleeping man, a small, leather-bound case in his hand. He did not use the methods he had employed with Agnes. For Edgar, a more direct, yet still subtle approach was required. Arthur carefully administered a potent, fast-acting sedative, delivered via a discreet injection. Edgar stirred faintly, a soft groan escaping his lips, before sinking back into a deeper, unnatural slumber. The dog, drugged, remained curled, oblivious. Arthur then began his work. He moved with a chilling efficiency, almost an artistic flourish. He gathered the hidden stashes of cash, meticulously cataloging each banknote, each coin. He carefully removed several of Edgar's most valuable antique books, replacing them with less valuable copies he had acquired from a second-hand store in a neighboring town. He opened drawers, shifted furniture, creating the impression of a frantic search, a ransacking, but one that was oddly precise, leaving no obvious signs of forced entry. Finally, he turned his attention to Edgar himself. With practiced ease, Arthur moved Edgar's unconscious body from the armchair. He transported Edgar to a prepared location on the sprawling property of Forgotten, disused well, hidden deep within a thicket of overgrown brambles, long since dry and covered by a fragile wooden lid that Arthur had carefully reinforced. He lowered Edgar's body into the depths, ensuring no sound, no struggle. He then meticulously replaced the lid, scattering leaves and debris over it, making it utterly indistinguishable from the surrounding undergrowth. Before he left the farmhouse, Arthur added a final, chilling touch. He took a single significant item from Edgar's vast collection of valuable, intricately carved ivory chess piece and placed it prominently on the mantelpiece, clearly visible. It was a subtle, almost arrogant signature, a knowing gesture for a disappearance that would baffle investigators. The next morning, the grocery delivery boy noticed something was amiss. The dogs, usually barking furiously, were sluggish, quiet. The front door was ajar. He called the police. What the police found baffled them. The house had been clearly disturbed, but in an odd, inconsistent way. Valuables were missing, yet other easily marketable items remained untouched. There were signs of an intruder, yet no obvious forced entry. And Edgar Finch himself was gone, vanished. The local detective, a seasoned but somewhat overwhelmed officer named Miller, scratched his head. It's like someone broke in to steal, but didn't actually steal everything, he mused to his junior colleague, Officer Davies. And old Edgar, well, he just disappeared. No signs of a struggle. No blood. Nothing. The case was officially classified as a home invasion and a missing person. Given Edgar's reclusive nature, the general consensus among the townspeople was that he had either been robbed and then, disoriented, wandered off and met an unfortunate end in the wilderness, or, more darkly, that the thieves had done away with him to prevent identification. The discovery of a slightly larger sum of cash than expected in a secret compartment in the wall, planted by Arthur, of course, to reinforce the robbery theory, further cemented this belief. Arthur once again offered his sympathies. He shook Detective Miller's hand, expressing his concern for poor old Mr. Finch. He even suggested, with a thoughtful frown, that perhaps Edgar, known for his eccentricities, had simply decided to disappear off the grid. It was a plausible theory, one that subtly reinforced the narrative of a man choosing his own vanishing act. The disappearance of Edgar Finch was a louder ripple than Agnes's. It generated more local newspaper headlines, more hushed conversations. But it was still contained, still attributed to plausible, if unfortunate, circumstances. No one connected it to the quiet, tweed-wearing gentleman who continued to tend his roses and sip his Earl Grey. But Detective Miller, a man with an innate sense for things that were off, felt a prickle of unease. Two elderly residents, both somewhat isolated, both disappearing without a trace in a relatively short period. It gnawed at him. He couldn't quite articulate why, but something felt wrong. Too clean. Too convenient. He began, informally at first, to review the files. Agnes Periwinkle. Edgar Finch. Different circumstances, different locations, yet a similar, unsettling lack of evidence. He started compiling a mental list of other elderly residents living alone in Oakhaven. He began to pay a little more attention to the quiet Mr. Penhaligon, who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time to offer a sympathetic word, a convenient theory. Arthur, meanwhile, sensed the faint tremor of suspicion. He saw Detective Miller's eyes linger on him a fraction of a second too long during a chance encounter at the post office. He noticed Miller's patrol car occasionally driving past his house, a little slower than necessary. It was a subtle shift, but Arthur's antennae for detection were finely tuned. This wasn't a problem for Arthur. It was a challenge. He relished the game, the intellectual sparring. The presence of a competent, if not yet fully aware, adversary only added a layer of excitement to his macabre artistry. He understood that the pattern, however subtle, might eventually be discerned. He understood that a third disappearance, if not handled with exquisite care, could ignite a full-blown investigation, threatening his carefully constructed world. He needed to change his tactics. He needed to be bolder, yet simultaneously more evasive. He needed to make the next disappearance not just a vanishing act, but a message that would sow fear, confusion, and doubt, throwing the authorities off his scent entirely. Arthur began to research, poring over old newspaper archives in his study, rereading forgotten true crime accounts. He studied the psychology of fear, the dynamics of community panic. He sought to understand how to manipulate not just individuals but an entire town. He was preparing not just for another act of erasure, but for a grand, terrifying performance. He had learned from Agnes the art of charm and infiltration. He had learned from Edgar the manipulation of isolation and paranoia. Now he sought to combine these lessons, to elevate his work to a new level of insidious brilliance. The quiet dusk of Arthur Penhaligon had given way to a widening gyre, a slow, inexorable whirlpool of terror. And Oakhaven, still largely unaware of the silent predator in its midst, was about to be drawn into its chilling depths. The Centenarian killer was no longer content with mere disappearance. He was ready to unleash something far more profound, far more terrifying: fear itself. The stage was set for a new kind of horror, one that would redefine the very meaning of safety in this once peaceful town. Detective Miller stood in his small, cluttered office, a map of Oakhaven spread across his desk. Red pushpins marked the homes of Agnes Periwinkle and Edgar Finch. 2 pins, 2 disappearances, 2 cold cases. He stared at them, a knot of frustration tightening in his stomach. The official reports offered plausible explanations. Agnes, a confused elderly woman, wandered off. Edgar, a reclusive hoarder, robbed and possibly abducted by opportunistic thieves. But Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something else, something far more sinister, was at play. He traced a line between the 2 pins. Not geographically close, but close enough to be in the same small town. Both victims were elderly, living alone with minimal social connections. The similarities, while not screaming serial killer, were enough to prick at his seasoned detective's intuition. He felt like he was looking at the surface of a placid lake, knowing there was something dark and powerful moving beneath. Miller's colleagues, and indeed his superiors, saw his growing obsession as a symptom of an overworked mind. "Miller, you're seeing ghosts," his captain, a perpetually weary man named Johnson, had told him. "These things happen in small towns. People get old, people get lonely, people get robbed. It's not a conspiracy." But Miller couldn't dismiss it. He knew Oakhaven. He'd grown up here. This level of unexplained vanishing, this peculiar lack of evidence, was unprecedented. He started revisiting the original files, poring over every detail, every witness statement. He reread the accounts of the neighbors, the grocery delivery boy, even the brief, polite condolences offered by Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur. The name echoed in his mind. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something about the man. Too calm, too composed, always offering a helpful theory, always too articulate. Miller remembered Arthur's perfectly pressed tweed, his watery blue eyes that seemed to observe everything, yet reveal nothing. He decided to initiate a low-key, unofficial investigation. He started with casual conversations. He dropped by Mrs. Gable's house, ostensibly to check on her, but subtly steer the conversation towards Arthur. How's Mr. Penhaligon doing? Still tending his roses? Mrs. Gable would predictably praise Arthur's kindness, his thoughtful gestures. He's such a gentleman, detective. Always a kind word. Miller gathered snippets of information. Arthur's background was vague. No one really knew where he came from or much about his past. He was a widower. His wife Eleanor had died years ago. Peacefully, he always said. Miller made a mental note to check Eleanor's death certificate, a detail that seemed innocuous but nagged at him. Meanwhile, Arthur was acutely aware of Miller's subtle scrutiny. He saw the detective's patrol car making slightly more frequent passes by his house. He noticed Miller's eyes on him during his weekly trip to the hardware store. It was a dance, a subtle game of cat and mouse, and Arthur was enjoying it immensely. He felt a surge of exhilaration, a validation of his own intellect. He was not just erasing lives, he was outsmarting the very system designed to catch him. This new challenge, this burgeoning suspicion, fueled Arthur's next move. He needed to make the next disappearance so confounding, so unnerving, that it would not only deflect suspicion from himself but also cast a shadow of doubt over the entire community, making everyone question what they thought they knew about Oakhaven. He needed to create an atmosphere of widespread unease, a fog of uncertainty that would paralyze the investigation. His next target was Miss Evelyn Hawthorne, an 85-year-old retired schoolteacher. Evelyn lived in the heart of Oakhaven, in a charming cottage filled with antique furniture and the scent of lavender and old books. Unlike Agnes and Edgar, Evelyn was not a recluse. She was an active member of the Oakhaven Historical Society, the local book club, and still volunteered to read to children at the library once a week. She was known, loved, and would be instantly missed. Her disappearance would be a seismic event in Oakhaven. Arthur approached Evelyn not with charm, but with a carefully cultivated intellectual curiosity. He started attending the Historical Society meetings, sitting quietly in the back, absorbing the discussions. He would occasionally pose a thoughtful question, demonstrating a surprising depth of knowledge about local history. Evelyn, a woman who prided herself on her intellect, was intrigued. He engaged her in conversations after meetings, discussing obscure historical facts, local folklore, the subtle nuances of Oakhaven's past. He presented himself as a kindred spirit, a fellow intellectual with a profound respect for history. He slowly gained her trust, not as a friendly neighbor, but as a respected peer. Evelyn, delighted to find someone who shared her passions, began to invite Arthur to her home for tea and discussions. These sessions were Arthur's masterclass in manipulation. He listened intently to Evelyn's stories, her insights, her detailed knowledge of Oakhaven. He learned about her routines, her most prized possessions, her fears. He learned, crucially, about her deep-seated belief in local ghost stories, particularly those surrounding the old Oakhaven Mill, a long-abandoned structure on the edge of town, said to be haunted by the spirits of long-dead workers. Arthur meticulously planned Evelyn's disappearance to exploit this belief. He would not just make her vanish. He would make her vanish into one of Oakhaven's oldest, most unsettling legends. The evening Evelyn disappeared was a stormy one. A fierce gale rattled the windows of Oakhaven, and rain lashed against the cobblestone streets. Arthur had arranged to visit Evelyn for a late-night discussion about a rare historical text she had recently acquired. He arrived, a dark trench coat over his tweed jacket, a leather-bound book tucked under his arm. Inside, Evelyn's cottage was warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the tempest outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Evelyn, animated by the storm and the prospect of intellectual debate, was in high spirits. Arthur engaged her in a fascinating conversation, gradually steering it towards the supernatural, to the legends of the Oakhaven Mill. He spoke of the whispers, the ghostly apparitions, the feeling of an ancient presence. He subtly used atmospheric details, the howling wind, the creaking of the old cottage, the flickering firelight to enhance the sense of unease. Then, at a carefully chosen moment, Arthur suggested, with a knowing look, that perhaps the storm was stirring something. "They say," he murmured, his voice low and conspiratorial, "that on nights like this, the veil between worlds is thinnest. Perhaps even the old mill. It might be more active tonight." Evelyn, usually a pragmatic woman, was captivated. Her eyes, wide with a childlike wonder, reflected the flickering firelight. "You truly think so, Arthur?" she whispered. "One can never be certain of these things," Arthur replied, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "But wouldn't it be fascinating to see, to feel the lingering energies of such a place, on such a night?" He was not suggesting they go to the mill. He was merely planting the seed, appealing to her intellectual curiosity, her love for Oakhaven's history, and her secret fascination with the supernatural. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then, driven by a thrill she hadn't felt in years, a blend of scholarly curiosity and a touch of daring, she made her decision. "Perhaps," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Perhaps just a quick drive past, to feel the atmosphere." Arthur nodded, his face a picture of thoughtful agreement. "A perfectly sound academic endeavor, my dear Evelyn." They drove in Arthur's old, unassuming sedan, the wipers struggling against the deluge. The journey to the mill was short, the ancient structure looming out of the darkness, a skeletal silhouette against the stormy sky. As they approached, Arthur pulled over, killing the engine, plunging them into near-total darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning. "Can you feel it?" Arthur murmured, his voice barely audible above the wind. "The weight of the past?" Evelyn, already convinced, shivered. "Yes," she breathed. "It's palpable." Arthur then reached into his satchel, producing a small, ornate silver locket. "I found this in an old antique shop," he said, handing it to her. "They say it belonged to one of the mill workers, lost a century ago. Perhaps, if one were to return it to its rightful place, to the heart of the mill itself, it might appease the spirits." He was appealing to her sense of historical duty. Her belief in the Arthur Penhaligon's meticulous patterns had begun to ripple through Oakhaven in ways subtle, yet profound. Each disappearance was no longer just a solitary act of erasure, it was a thread in a web, invisible to the casual observer, but tangible to those with even a flicker of intuition. Detective Miller, increasingly unsettled by the anomalies in the files, now approached the situation with cautious precision. Two vanished elderly citizens, plausible explanations failing to hold under scrutiny, and now whispers from neighbors hinted at a pattern, though no one could articulate it. Arthur, ever vigilant, had noted the detective's growing interest. Each patrol past his home, each lingering glance at his meticulously maintained rose garden, fueled an almost decadent thrill within him. He had always enjoyed the intellectual game, the chessboard of human behavior. Now, with Detective Miller circling closer, the stakes had escalated. Miss Evelyn Hawthorne, meanwhile, had vanished into the storm-soaked legend of the Oakhaven Mill. The townspeople speculated wildly. Some suggested she had gotten lost in the storm, others whispered of ghosts and spirits. Arthur's intervention had been silent, almost invisible. He had ensured that Evelyn's disappearance would stir fear and fascination in equal measure, leaving just enough evidence to ignite imagination, but too little to trace back to him. Arthur now focused on reinforcing his invisibility. He began attending town meetings less frequently, appearing only when necessary, often with his cane in hand, a slight limp suggesting frailty. He became the archetype of harmlessness, the elderly gentleman one would least suspect. Meanwhile, he meticulously planned his next moves, each disappearance carefully layered, each act calculated to enhance the illusion of randomness. Detective Miller, however, had begun mapping Oakhaven's elderly residents living alone, cross-referencing routines, social interactions, and vulnerabilities. He had noticed Arthur's uncanny proximity to each missing person, the polite condolences, the perfectly timed appearances. The detective had yet to confront Arthur directly, but a seed of suspicion had firmly rooted in his mind. Arthur observed this subtle pressure with delight. For him, Miller was not an obstacle, but a stimulus, a puzzle, a challenge to his brilliance. Every subtle surveillance, every whispered suspicion, was a testament to Arthur's growing dominance of the social and physical landscape of Oakhaven. As the months passed, Arthur's control extended beyond individual disappearances. The town itself became a stage. He studied local news, noting how quickly reports faded, how gossip churned and dispersed, and how fear could be manipulated without overt action. Every streetlight flicker, every newspaper headline, every town whisper became an instrument in his symphony of absence. Winter came to Oakhaven with a cold, biting clarity. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling sound, erasing footprints, and creating a perfect cover for Arthur's next act. While most residents sought comfort by their firesides, Arthur's mind was in perpetual motion, plotting, predicting, refining his methods. Detective Miller had begun informal interviews with townspeople, cataloging minor oddities, inconsistencies, and overlooked details. One remark from Mrs. Gable lingered in his mind. Arthur's eye so calm, so attentive, always seemed to know more than he let on. Another neighbor noted the strange coincidence that Arthur often appeared near each missing person's last known location. These threads, when woven together, formed a picture that was almost too frightening to contemplate. Arthur, sensing the tightening scrutiny, decided to escalate his sophistication. He targeted someone entirely different, Martin Calloway, a middle-aged, reclusive writer living in a converted barn at the edge of town. Unlike his previous victims, Martin was younger, alert, and unpredictably a variable that required a new approach. Arthur shifted from charm to psychological manipulation, leaving carefully placed letters, anonymous notes, and subtle warnings that drew Martin into a labyrinth of fear and confusion. Martin's paranoia grew rapidly. He installed cameras, reinforced locks, and began questioning neighbors. Yet each precaution played into Arthur's hands. He orchestrated small, inexplicable disturbances. A window left slightly ajar, a misplaced book, a shadow glimpsed at the edge of the property line. By the time Martin realized he was being hunted, Arthur had already dissected the contours of his routines, habits, and fears. Simultaneously, Detective Miller's suspicion crystallized into intent. He began to trace connections, linking Martin's psychological torment to prior disappearances. The pattern was chilling. All victims had been vulnerable, isolated, or trusting, and all were connected, however subtly, to Arthur Penhaligon. Miller now faced the horrifying possibility that he was dealing with not just a clever criminal, but a predator whose understanding of human behavior was disturbingly profound. Arthur, aware of Miller's focus, decided the next disappearance would be both his masterpiece and a test. The precision of the vanishings would challenge even the detective's deductive abilities. He orchestrated a public illusion, ensuring townspeople observed minor, yet seemingly incriminating, activity by an unknown intruder, while he executed his true plan in silence, leaving no trace. By the end of Chapter 5, the stage was fully set. Oakhaven was caught between ignorance and fear. The detective's pursuit had sharpened, and Arthur Penhaligon, the Centenarian killer, stood at the apex of his control. The predator and the pursuer were now engaged in a psychological duel, each move calculated, each observation critical. The town, blissfully unaware of the true horror in its midst, teetered on the edge of revelation and chaos. And Arthur, patient and meticulous, waited for the dusk to fall once more, his pale blue eyes reflecting not just the fading sunlight, but the dark promise of calculated terror yet to come.